child is born, unto us a son is given. Let every heart prepare his throne, let every nation under heaven come and worship.
The award-winning documentary, Waiting for Superman, details the abysmal condition of the U.S. public education system. You just saw some statistics you probably don't even need anymore, but here's a few. More than 1.2 million students drop out of school in the United States every year. That's 6,000 per day. By the end of 8th grade, U.S. students are, on average, 2 years behind the math being studied in other industrialized countries. And here's another one. Only 32% of 8th graders can read proficiently in the United States. 32%. Now, granted, these numbers are of public school students, not private or homeschooled, but given that about 90% of America's children are educated in public schools, this is a problem. The word crisis is an understatement. As the years go on and U.S. students fall further and further behind, our less educated workforce and population will be less competitive in the global marketplace. This will affect the economy, poverty rates, crime rates, neighborhood stability, birth rates, overall national well-being. Now, as much of a crisis as we have in our schooling system, I can actually think of an even bigger educational crisis. It's the one in our churches and our Sunday schools. The Christian Sunday school system, which was started a couple hundred years ago, was once a beacon of hope in an ignorant world. Millions of young people and adults went to Sunday school on Sunday morning to learn. They went to church on Sunday to worship, and they went to Sunday school on Sunday to learn. The Sunday school system was actually the inspiration for the public education system, but churches have struggled to keep educating children and adults as well as they once did. As a result, religious ignorance is on the rise, and poorly educated children turn into poorly educated adults. In a 2010 Pew Forum survey, for example, thousands of Americans were asked a battery of 32 questions to test their religious knowledge. Out of 32 basic religious questions, and these are pretty basic religious questions, the average score was 16. Christians scored on average 15.7 out of 32. Do you want to know who scored the highest on the survey? Atheists and agnostics. They averaged 20.9. At least they know what they don't believe. Here are some of the results, though, more specifically. According to the survey, only 66% of Christians could name the first book of the Bible. What is that? Genesis. Only 55% of Christians knew that the Golden Rule is not one of the 10 Commandments. You don't have to pretend to actually know that. 55% of Catholics did not know that Catholics believe the bread and wine turn into the body and blood of Christ during communion. And lest we judge Catholics for their ignorance, 47% of Protestants did not know that Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation. It gets worse, though. In another survey quoted by Albert Mohler, 83% of born-again Christians thought that God helps those who help themselves is in the Bible. 12% of adults think that Joan of Arc is Noah's wife. 50% of Americans think that Sodom and Gomorrah were husband and wife. And 1/3 of Americans think that the Sermon on the Mount was preached by Billy Graham. This is a crisis. The consequences of this education crisis are more serious and eternal than our public education crisis. I mean, if people don't learn math, they'll have a hard time getting a job. If people don't learn the Bible, they won't meet Jesus Christ. What's the greater crisis? And this is precisely why God in the book of Deuteronomy gives the Israelites explicit instructions to teach their children the great truths of the faith as early as they could. In chapter 4, for example, God tells them this in Deuteronomy: teach my commands to your children and to their children after them, talking about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. I mean, this is a theme throughout the book of Deuteronomy, as parents are commanded to educate their children about God's ways early and often. And the educational mission of God's people was absolutely central as a component to who they were, what they were called to do. They were to pass on their identity and their faith in the next generation as soon as possible. They knew that their faith and their identity as a people was one generation away from extinction. In fact, this is pretty interesting if you think about it. Okay, if you don't know much about the book of Deuteronomy, it was like the handbook given to the Israelites just after they had left Egypt. They had escaped Egypt, and they were getting ready to go into the Promised Land, and God gives them this book of Deuteronomy about how to set up things, how to live in the Promised Land. And one of the themes in the book of Deuteronomy is before you go in there, before you build your houses, before you plant your fields, before you paint your walls, set up your schools. Teach the kids. And this is why we're talking about it this morning. As Jeremy said, we're in a series right now on children. It's called All God's Children, Learn How to Raise Kids the Way God Raises Us. We talked about how to love kids the way God raises us, how to protect kids the way God raises us. But how do you teach kids? This is a fundamental part of our assignment with regard to children, whether we're not, or not we're a parent. Paul tells the Ephesians, for example, fathers, bring your children up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Whether or not we're a dad, this is our collective educational assignment. Teach kids the way of Christ. Yes, they need to learn math, they need to learn literacy, they need to learn physics, they need to learn not to ride motorcycles behind cars and try to jump over buildings. They need to learn all that, but what they really need to learn is the ways of Christ. They need to learn how to follow Jesus. How do you teach them that, though? Teaching is hard. People go to school. Raise your hand if you're a teacher. A lot of teachers here. People go to school for years to learn how to teach. People get PhDs in teaching. And even then, it doesn't always work. I'm a coach, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher. I have found teaching effectively, successfully is like one of the hardest things I do. I've been trying to teach my sixth grade basketball team this play. Real simple play. We're learning plays. I have written it out on papers and sent it home for them to study this play, simple play, with arrows so they know exactly where to go. I have diagrammed it on the dry erase board, this play. We have practiced the play over and over and over and over again, week after week after week. The other day, I called for the play. You would have thought I ordered a Chinese fire drill. They had no idea what they were doing. And these are relatively intelligent children. And this is really hard as a coach. It's even harder as a parent at home. For example, I am trying to teach my children to turn lights off after they leave a room. This makes sense, doesn't it? You're not in the room anymore. You don't need the light. You don't need to take the light with you. Because you can't do that. You can't, carry the light. The walls stop the light. And when you go into the other room, usually, what is there? More light. All you need to do is turn the light off and go into the next room and turn that light. Go on, people! On! This seems like a very simple lesson, but the light has not gone on yet. We're still struggling here. In fact, it feels like we're making backwards progress, like there are more lights on in our house now than... It's like my children are trying to land planes at night by turning on all the lights in the house so that pilots can see where the runway is. Teaching kids is hard. Children are distractible, forgetful. Children struggle to pay attention, even with relatively easy lessons like turning lights off. It's hard to teach them easy lessons. How are we as non-experts supposed to teach them hard ones? Like loving God, trusting Him, obeying His Son, praying. How are we supposed to do this? Is there good news here? Absolutely. Because the founder of our faith happens to be an excellent teacher. In fact, he was such a good teacher that people would actually call him good teacher. It was like the spontaneous title, good teacher. Well, yes, that's exactly what I am. People would call him good teacher. Mark writes this, for example, the people were amazed at his teaching, Jesus' teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. So this is good news that Jesus is a good teacher. It's good news for a couple of reasons. It's good news because we are his students, and he teaches us well. But it's good news because we are fellow teachers who have the opportunity to learn from him. He was an expert at teaching his children, and we have the opportunity to learn from him as we teach ours. And that's the question that I want to talk about and answer, hopefully, this morning. How does Jesus teach his children, and what can we learn as we try to teach our own? I actually have a lot to say about this, so I had to get lubricated, which means I'm going to run out of time, but we'll try. Jesus was very good at teaching children. We learn a lot of lessons from him on how to do it, like this one. Tell stories. Jesus told stories. Lots and lots and lots of stories. He spoke in parables. It was one of the distinguishing marks of Jesus as a teacher. Matthew writes, for example, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. I love this next line. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. Do you know what a parable is? It's a story, but it's a story with a point. I mean, the word parable comes from the Greek word parabole, which means to throw beside. Para means beside. Bole means to throw. Get the word ball from bole, to throw beside. And Jesus was always throwing something beside a point he wanted to make. I mean, he had points to make, right? He had points to make, doctrinal truths to teach us. But he didn't just tell them to us. Would we have remembered them? No, it would have been boring, too. He did not make his point without throwing a story beside it to convey the meaning. He tells a parable, he throws a parable beside it so that we can remember it and understand it. He didn't say anything without using a parable. In fact, it might have been kind of annoying to have Jesus as your teacher. Teacher, tell me about this. Well, that reminds me of a story. Teacher, why did this happen? Well, let me tell you a story. Teacher, why do you always teach us in stories? The best way for you to understand is by me telling you a story. Kids like stories, right? What do they ask for every night before they go to bed? Tell me a story. They're asking to be taught. So if you want to teach them, tell them a story. You know, this kind of reminds me of a story. Last fall, I was in the backyard, and I heard my, at the time, 3-year-old daughter yelling from inside. This is a different yelling from inside story. I've told a couple yelling from inside stories. This is different. She was supposed to be resting, but I heard her yelling. It was a strange yell, though. She was supposed to be inside napping. But I heard her yelling kind of from the outside, from the front of the house. So I went around to the front of the house and I saw her. She was leaning halfway out her second-story window with the screen up, yelling back and forth loudly with her neighbor friend 2 doors down. I yelled at her loudly, and she flipped back in real quickly. And I went inside. I knew where she was. And I yelled at her some more. This was one of those moments where I needed to frighten her badly. She knows not to do this, but apparently she had not learned the lesson. Now that night I wanted to reinforce the lesson. My divine truth about not leaning out of windows had not taken, so I threw a story beside it. I put her down and she asked for a story, and I said, "Sure, I can tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a princess named Miranda. And she lived in a tall tower. Like Rapunzel? Like Rapunzel. And her parents wanted her to be happy, but she knew she needed rules to be happy. They knew she needed rules to be happy. And if she didn't obey the rules, she could get hurt. she could even die. One of those rules was to not open windows. Miranda had been very excited to hear this story, but all of a sudden she wasn't anymore. Her eyes got big and she stopped smiling. I continued. One day a prince came to talk to Princess Miranda, and Miranda knew she couldn't open the window because her parents loved her and wanted her to live, but she wanted to see the prince, so she did it. As she was opening the window, though, she slipped, and she fell out of the window all the way to the ground. Did she die, Daddy? No, she didn't die, but she broke her femur. The femur is a very important bone. It's the biggest bone in your body. So you always got to try and teach them. And it was broken. And Princess Miranda had to go to the hospital where they gave her a cast. She couldn't play at all for 6 weeks, and then 4 more weeks of rehab after they took the screws out. She felt very bad and told her parents she was sorry. Her parents forgave her, but told her never to open the window ever again. And at this point, Miranda says, she won't. And she hasn't, especially after we put the window locks on, finally. We learned our lesson too. Teach your kids by telling them stories. Lots and lots and lots of stories. Stories about Jesus, stories from the Bible, stories from your childhood, stories from history, true stories, made-up stories. Children will forget our lessons and our lectures, but they won't forget our stories. Tell a story. What else would Jesus have us do as we teach our children? This. Go on a field trip. One of the things I love about Jesus' teaching ministry is that it was not classroom-based. Did you ever realize this? It was always outside. They were always outside doing something. They were always on a field trip. In fact, there's this really important phrase that I really like in the Gospels. The phrase is this: while Jesus was with them on the way. Jesus was always with his disciples going somewhere on the way, doing something. Like in Mark, the author writes, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them. Mark also records in chapter 10, as Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him. Luke writes, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds crushed him. This was a crowded field trip. Later in Luke, he writes, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way. And later he writes, then the 2 disciples told him what had happened when Jesus was on the way. So Jesus was always going with his disciples somewhere, taking his disciples with them. They were climbing mountains, they were crossing lakes, they were eating dinner, they were going to church, they were visiting strangers, they were healing sick people, they were going to funerals. They were always on a field trip. And Jesus was with them the whole time, talking about what they were experiencing, what they should expect, how they should react. They weren't sitting in desks at a classroom. They were out living life. Why? Because the world is so much more of a classroom than the classroom is a classroom. Things happen outside a classroom that don't happen in a classroom. You see things, you meet people, you have experiences, you have conflicts that you got to work through. This is why we go on field trips when we're kids. As I was thinking about this point, in fact, I started thinking of all the field trips I went on as a kid. You guys remember the field trips you went on as a kid? I don't remember most of the lessons I learned or the books I had read growing up, but I remember the places we went, the things we did. We went to the zoo. We went to the Jefferson Memorial Expansion like every year. We went to Cahokia Mountains. We went to the Museum of Transportation. We went to the travel agency to learn about the world. We went to Botanical Gardens. We went to Junior Achievement. We went to Creve Coeur Park to learn about the Indian girl with the broken heart who jumped off the cliff, Creve Coeur. Did you learn that story? We went to a synagogue. In high school, I went to Washington, D.C. We went to the Chrysler plant. We went to the Wolf Sanctuary. We went to Forest Park. We went to the planetarium. We went to Washington University. My mom was Cub Scout den leader. She took us to Red Lobster to teach us about the ocean. We went to downtown St. Charles. We went to the Pumpkin Patch. We went to Mud Cave out by Beaumont. Anybody ever been to Mud Cave? And my teachers were there teaching us. And I remember it. That's why when my kids go on field trips to school, Michelle and I always sign up because we want to be there. I mean, this is how kids learn out in the world. You want to teach your kids about God's world, you got to take them out in it. A few months ago, this reminds me of a story. A few months ago, Michelle and I had a free Saturday afternoon with the kids. We never have free Saturday afternoons with the kids. So we had a free Saturday afternoon with the kids. We thought, we could just crash at home, and that'd be fine. But let's go do something. So instead of just crashing at home, we went to Grant's Farm. It's free, except for the parking, which we didn't discover until we got to the front of the parking line. I don't carry cash. They don't take debit cards. So the parking attendant told us we had to drive through and leave, go get money, and come back. I thought of just parking. They would never know. Realized that would be wrong. So we left and got money and came back. That's one lesson for the children, integrity. And a second lesson, carry cash. Then we waited in line for the tram. It was hot. The line was long. The kids were getting fussy. Lesson 3, patience. Finally, we got on the tram, got to drive through the park. We drove by the Civil War gun barrel fence and General Grant's old house. Drove by the animals. My favorite part was when we drove by those trees in the southwest corner and all the trees are like cut perfectly underneath. Do you know how that is? The deer. They're all the same height, and the deer will stand up on their back legs and chew the branches of the trees, all the same height. All the trees over there, they're all like perfectly even. Lesson 4, hire deer as your tree trimmers, I guess. We went to the bird show. We went to feed the goats. Learned how aggressive, thirsty little goats can be. I said to the kids, just think how thirsty those goats in hell are going to be. I didn't really say that. Lesson 5, no milk for goats in hell. Went to go see the camels right by the Bush Mansion. Kids love the Bush Mansion. It's as far as you can get. Love the Bush Mansion. Talked about mansions, how our mansion is heaven, is a heavenly mansion bigger than even the Bush Mansion. And now when I talk about heaven and I illustrate it as a mansion, I can say it's like the Bush Mansion. Then we went to the beer garden. Michelle and I had a free beer. Lesson 7. Beer in heaven, I don't know. If you want your kids to learn about God, take them out into God's world. It's his classroom. Our kids just need teachers to take them there. Jesus taught his children by telling them stories, by taking them on field trips. And lastly, he would have us do this as teachers. Ask questions. Not only was Jesus always taking the students on field trips and telling them stories, he was always asking them questions. I mean, we like to think that Jesus came with the answers, right? And he did, but he came with questions as much as he did with answers. I skimmed through the Bible to make a note of some of Jesus' questions. I actually quickly gave up because there's so many. Questions like these: who do you say that I am? Who are my mother and my brothers? Who is greater, the one who sits at the head of the table or the one who serves? What can a man give in exchange for his soul? If a man loses a sheep and has 99, will he leave the 99 to find the one? What do you think? Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? What did Moses command you? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Why do you ask for a sign? Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? Why are you angry with me for healing on the Sabbath? In fact, sometimes Jesus answers questions with questions. In Matthew 15, for example, there's some leaders who are getting frustrated with the way Jesus keeps breaking all the rules. Here's the scene. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Jesus replied, and why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? I love that. I'm not going to answer your question. In fact, here's a better question. Jesus was very good at asking questions to help people learn and understand and think. This is how he taught. It was a teaching tool. He wanted people talking, one of them thinking, one of them debating. He didn't just give them answers. He gave them questions so they could think and wonder and debate. Answers might make us feel better, but they tend to stop discussion. It's like in small group when someone asks a question and I know the answer. What's the temptation? Answer it. But what happens? People stop talking. This is pretty important when it comes to teaching children. It's very tempting to want to give children answers. It's tempting to show kids how much you know. But it's more important in the long run to stimulate their curiosity, to teach them how to think, to raise issues they might not have realized yet. Jesus was very good at doing this, at asking questions to lead them to the answers. He was very good at throwing down a big fat question and then walking away. It's why science fairs are so big at our house. Because it teaches them to ask good questions and figure out the answers. I grew up doing science fairs. Anybody else grow up doing science fairs? Okay, science fair doers unite. All two of us. My dad and I worked on science fairs year after year after year. I answered some pretty big questions, like by myself, okay? Like, why does the wind blow out of Wind Cave? I know. How can water go up pipes? Looks like magic. It's not. I learned how it happens. Why does the sun change position in the sky throughout the year? Did you ever notice that? Do you know why? Why does the sun change position in the sky throughout the year? It's the axis, see? We know. We figured it out. And the boys and I have asked and answered a lot of great questions over the years. We've asked how many pets and people live in our neighborhood. It was a science fair experiment. We figured it out. What's the best way to find north? There are lots of ways to find north. What's the best way to find north? How many types of fingerprints do people have? We figured that out. What would the Big Dipper look like from a different position in the galaxy? Figure that out. But don't get the wrong idea. We're not asking these questions so that they can learn about the Big Dipper or water pressure or fingerprints. We're asking these questions so they can learn about God. So that they can learn to talk to God, to ask Him questions, to dialogue with their Maker, to listen to His answers. We're asking these questions so they can wonder who God made them to be, what He wants them to do. We're asking these questions so they can learn about Jesus, who He is, why He came, what He wants. God could just tell them all this, but He'd rather we learn how to ask. I mean, you want to teach your kids, teach them how to ask, teach them how to dialogue with the Lord of the universe. This is one of those times when time limits on sermons can get really frustrating because there's so much more to talk about here. In fact, a couple quick little bonus points. Jesus was such a good teacher. He gives parents so many great lessons like this. Study the textbook. I mean, he had a textbook. He used some unconventional methods, but he had a textbook. What was it? It was the Old Testament. I mean, long after he had retired as a teacher and was working in an educational store, he left them the textbook. Also, be an example. Jesus dared not teach his disciples anything he wasn't willing to do or demonstrate. He didn't teach them how to walk on water without actually walking on water. He didn't teach them about sacrifice without making the greatest sacrifice possible. What I want to end, though, there's a lot more points to make, but what I want to end with is this. If you've seen Waiting for Superman, anybody ever seen that documentary? It's very engaging and challenging. If you've seen the documentary, you know where the title of the documentary comes from. One of the educators who features prominently in the movie, his name is Jeffrey Canada, who's the president of the Harlem Children's Zone. Canada was raised in abject poverty in the South Bronx. His school and his neighborhood were a mess. He wasn't learning, he wasn't growing as a kid, but he loved Superman from television and the comics. And when things were bad, Superman would always show up and save the day, at least in the comics. He just kept waiting for Superman to show up and rescue him from his poverty and his ignorance. Eventually, his mother told him that Superman wasn't real. He was devastated. Canada decided, however, to become that hero. He became an education reformer. He founded the Harlem Children's Zone, which is a new type of school that serves students from birth to college, and they push their kids hard. They push them through school most of the year, longer hours in the day, on Saturday, school on Saturday. The program has been so successful that the Harlem Zone has been expanded. President Obama has tried to replicate the program around the country. Finally, children are learning, and Harlem parents have hope in their desperation. My point, The children of earth are in an even more desperate spot. We are trapped in the poverty of our sin and our ignorance of God. Our spiritual crisis is far greater than our educational crisis. We're waiting for Superman, and he came. Jesus came to teach us how to live and show us God. He came to rescue us from our ignorance. Our children, though, are still waiting. They're waiting for Superman. They're waiting for someone to teach them about life and God. They're waiting for someone to teach them how to love others, how to be forgiven of their sins. They're waiting for someone to prepare them. They're waiting for their church to find them a bigger building with larger classes where they can learn and grow and study. They're waiting. They're sitting in spiritual poverty waiting for someone to save them. Are we going to teach them as Jesus teaches us? Or are we going to keep them waiting for Superman? That's a question. I'll let you think about it. Let's pray.